I've been playing Diablo 4 and Diablo 2 the past few weeks, and I still find myself preferring the two-decade-old classic Diablo 2. It's a slower, more methodical game than modern ARPG entries, but the way the game intertwines combat and character progression so well has kept its dedicated audience engaged for decades. Diablo 4 has modernized the ARPG experience for wider audiences, but in its efforts to build out an ongoing live service model, the game has left behind some of the interesting character building decisions for more immediately gratifying gameplay. From the outset, the games appear very similar. Diablo 2 and Diablo 4 are both action RPG games where you control a character from an isometric perspective. You defeat monsters to gain experience, navigate randomized maps, and hunt for randomized items to make your character stronger. However, the underpinning design choices lead to very different experiences. Let's start by taking a look at my early game barbarian for each game. At level 1, they are pretty similar, hitting one mob at a time. By as early as level 5 in Diablo 4 though, I already have Whirlwind, the leading groups of enemies. In Diablo 2, I'm still hitting monsters one at a time, and it's only at level 30 before Whirlwind even becomes available to me. From this point onward, Diablo 4 leans towards more immediate empowerment, while Diablo 2 focuses on more deliberate, incremental progression. Let's be clear though that there's nothing inherently wrong with Diablo 4's approach. The fundamental combat mechanics feel great and snappy. Players get to engage in the power fantasy element of the game earlier. However, a consequence of this design choice is that the ability to clear screens of mobs at a time has become consistent gameplay experience instead of an endgame achievement. Diablo 4 skips a significant chunk of design space that could have existed between the confines of killing one mob at a time and clearing screens of mobs at a time. Instead, the game is designed entirely around the expectation that player characters will be deleting screens of enemies consistently throughout the game. This restricts many possibilities for enemy design, as the length of time players will be meaningfully interacting with enemies is very short. It also forces the system's underpinning character progression to feel artificially elongated and superficial. Enemy design. One complaint I've heard is that the enemies in Diablo 4 lack variety and all feel kind of the same. Now, I personally think that there's a decent variety of enemies visually. The issue at hand though is that many of them feel functionally the same, because your character can invalidate most of them by killing them so fast. This causes any nuance in their functional design to be trivial. Look at this Pit Lord in Diablo 4 and Diablo 2. In Diablo 2, he's tanky, comes in packs, deals heavy melee damage and fire damage, requiring me to pack fire resistance and to kite properly to not get surrounded. Here are the Pit Lords in Diablo 4. Instead, to increase challenge throughout the game, Diablo 4's solution is to inflate enemy numbers to the point where they can one-shot you, and to tack on external, unimmersive mechanics. These include crowd control that lasts way too long, and on-death, one-hit explosions. These are challenging and punishing for sure, but certainly not fun. The frustrations of this design are then compounded by the fact that there is little that can be done to mitigate these effects through itemization and skill trees, the primary systems for progression. Since nuances in enemies are made negligent by how fast players are able to kill monsters, the design for difficulty relies on artificial mechanics that do not match the enemy design aesthetically. Diablo 2, on the other hand, has memorable enemy design thanks to much less initial player power and a more gradual power curve when compared to Diablo 4. For the most part, characters cannot kill enemies appropriate for their level fast enough to trivialize their nuances, at least until the very late endgame. This forces players to respect the details in the enemy design. You remember that those beetles deal massive lightning damage and come in numbers, but are easily kiteable. You learn to stack lightning resistance and maneuver around them. You learn that you can't always jump into packs, and instead have to pick small fights carefully. Archers in Act 1 are protected by melee attackers that serve as their shield, forcing you to think about target priority. Ghosts can phase through walls, forcing you to reposition and find different angles of attack. The fire and electric council dudes in Act 3 are fast, and can heal each other, so it's best to try pulling them into one-on-one fights. Pygmies will swarm at you with numbers, so having an AoE solution or finding choke points in the environment is paramount. Player-to-monster power balance in Diablo 2 is handled carefully in a way that for most of the game, you have to learn and adapt your strategy to deal with the different gameplay challenges that the enemy mobs represent. This is largely absent in Diablo 4, since jumping in and clearing them all is often the best answer. While Diablo 4 has strong game feel in its attacks and abilities, the generator spender system doesn't feel great. Cooldowns feel restrictive and pigeonhole gameplay into the same skill rotations and cycle of engagement. Jump in, master 4 skills in order, use a basic skill to generate resource to do it all over again. I believe part of the issue is the huge discrepancy in effectiveness between your core skill spenders and basic skill generators. Basic skills are so ineffective compared to your core skills, you would always want to use your core skills over your basic skills, given no limitations. Players simply don't enjoy being forced to use weak options that have limited effect on gameplay, just as a prerequisite and time filler to use the impactful skills that do affect gameplay. Cooldowns too similarly prevent players from using the skills that they want. Every second a player is waiting for a cooldown is a second they are not interacting meaningfully with the game. The enjoyable part of Diablo 4's combat is jumping in and whirlwinding. It's dashing everywhere with twisting blades, blowing up enemies, and dodging the horrible affixes. Cooldowns and resource management definitely have a place, as they can provide an additional layer of strategy and access for character growth, but the way they've been implemented in Diablo 4 just gets in the way of players engaging the combat in fun ways. There's just too much waiting. In Diablo 2, combat design takes a slower and more methodical approach. Characters fight enemies in longer skirmishes, only really evolving into the massive screen-clearing dopamine explosions at the very endgame. However, unlike Diablo 4, almost all skills in D2 have no cooldown, allowing you to use your favorite skills freely as long as you meet the level requirement. You are allowed to use whichever skill is most fun for you, and the game is designed around that allowance in mind, instead of requiring you to use lesser, weaker skills as a generator. At the start, your character feels weak and disempowered. Again, a stark contrast to Diablo 4, where you can blast through mobs as early as level 5. You have limited stamina for running, limited mana, slow run speed, and slow attack animations. While some criticize D2's mechanics for feeling clunky, all of these limitations in the early game act as axes for progression, which you improve upon through leveling and itemization, transforming gameplay in a big way as you develop your character. This to me is what makes the progression loop in Diablo 2 satisfying. So many different stats, attack speed, cast rate, elemental resistances, stamina, run walk speed, health, mana, all have transformative consequences on the actual gameplay experience. When you have stamina issues, a slow run walk, and not enough damage to wipe out enemy threats immediately, you are forced to take fights strategically, using environmental nuances to give yourself an advantage. Getting surrounded in D2 is usually a death sentence, requiring you to carefully manage mana, stamina, and enemy aggro. Combined with the varied enemy design mentioned earlier, you end up approaching each encounter slightly differently depending on the combination, number of enemies, and environmental positioning. This all adds to a more immersive combat experience where you're considering your resources and tactical options to overcome the forces of hell. You're sometimes fighting head-on, but also kiting, running away, repositioning, and selecting key targets. D4 in theory also has these kinds of interactions, but because player kill speed is always so high, jumping into packs and deleting mobs with your rotation ends up being the right strategy 90% of the time, making fights feel pretty samey. Another common point of criticism for Diablo 4 is the itemization and item affixes. They are both convoluted and unimmersive. Let's take a look at some of these affixes and notice how many conditional affixes there are. At the same time, I know exactly what they mean, and I have no idea what they mean, and if I did all the math, I could figure out what piece of gear is more optimal for my DPS each time, but I don't want to be doing the math for each piece of gear, and none of these stats are intuitive in understanding how they would affect my character in practice. I mean, just look at how many different types of damage stats Blizzard put into the game. This is what I meant earlier when I said that Blizzard is purposely obfuscating and overcomplicating progression, since they're insistent on having gameplay fixated around enabling players to blow up screens of monsters from early game to end game. They limit their design space for character growth seen in gameplay. The result is that they are left to design character progression entirely in the stat numbers. If their stat system is too basic, there will be nothing for players to figure out or chase after, so now we have almost 50 different damage stats on this patch notes page alone. Let's be clear here though, D4's damage formula is not particularly deep, it's just overly obtuse. The damage bucket model boils down to simple addition and multiplication, but instead of easy to understand variable names like X, Y, Z, they have these ridiculous affix names to hide the actual simplicity. Then they made the entire itemization system focused around legendary aspects, which I think is another huge mistake. Legendary aspects are so fundamentally transformative that they make or break builds. This causes two main issues. First, some legendary aspects are incredibly specific to certain skills, and add so much power they are basically required for that build at all times. Look at Blade Dancer for Twisting Blades. If I'm going a Twisting Blades build, this thing is always mandatory, and there's no other aspect that competes for this. Aspect of the Dire Whirlwind I will always consider and get on a Whirlwind build. When an item becomes that specific for one build, it loses a lot of that specialness because it feels purposely designed for that one usage. There are no extra build possibilities to consider. You use the Twisting Blades item in the Twisting Blades build, and the Whirlwind aspect in the Whirlwind build. Clear, cut, and dry. With limited trading options and strict level requirements preventing you to easily use items you find on one character onto an alternate character, finding legendary or unique items have aspects that are clearly not for your build feels especially bad. This problem is further compounded by the fact that you can remove aspects off legendaries and imprint them onto rare items. This makes rare and legendary items essentially the same. I know that they have different properties when it comes to the number of affixes and the numbers that they can actually roll, but in practice they feel identical once you move one aspect from one to the other. Hell, the rare item literally becomes a legendary. And since there's no reason to not have a legendary aspect on one of your item slots, you end up only looking for legendary items, unique items, and rare items to turn into legendary items. White items and blue items are categorically worthless, and item bases have negligible impact. Even picking up legendary items themselves feels underwhelming, because if aspects are extractable and can be placed onto any rare item, what you're really picking up is an aspect with stats on it, not a defined item that feels distinct based on its unique affix combinations. If everything can become a legendary, then nothing feels legendary. On top of all of that, items simply feel aesthetically bland and unimmersive. This is largely due to the large pool of uninteresting conditional affixes plaguing every item. Legendary items too lose their distinctiveness since their defining characteristic, the legendary aspect, can be transferred freely anyways. Unique items in Diablo 4 fare a little bit better in terms of how interesting they are to pick up, for at least as per their namesake, their aspects are distinctly unique, which adds personality to the item. However, the variety of these that realistically drop is too narrow, and aside for a few exceptions, their effectiveness isn't competitive with other legendary aspects to be considered in many cases. The whole sacred and ancestral classes of items are also particularly bland. There is no distinction between them other than that ancestral items have a higher item power range than sacred, which have a higher item power range than default items. The only difference between these, then, are the stat number rolls. In practice, players chase the same stats on gear over and over again for higher and higher numbers, which, when considering that enemy HP and damage scale, feels like you are looking for the exact same item repeatedly. Then there's the piece regarding drop rates and item management. As I mentioned earlier, at some point white and blue items become worthless, so all of your attention gets directed at yellow and orange drops. The issue here is that you're essentially required to pick up and check every single rare and legendary drop for a possible upgrade, since there's no way of knowing any other characteristic about the item without. This crowds your inventory fast, and with high drop rates, limited storage, lack of a loot filter, stash search, and a host of other quality of life item management features, managing loot becomes a tedious part of the game. Games like Diablo 2 and Path of Exile are able to ameliorate this issue by making item bases distinctive in their characteristics and incredibly relevant to itemization. They also show you what the item base is on drop, allowing you to skip over rare items that you know that you don't need just by understanding what the item base is. Speaking of Diablo 2, D2's itemization is often regarded to be one of D2's strongest aspects. Many people have criticized D2 for not having substantial endgame content, but then it begs the question of what drives players to continue to play D2 for over 2 decades. The answer is that D2's itemization systems are just that engaging. Affix-wise, D2 has none of the overcomplicated, unimmersive conditional affixes that have crowded D4's affix pool. Affixes in D2 are for the most part simple and straightforward. Enhanced damage, added elemental damage, increased attack speed, elemental resistances, damage reduction, among others. With D2 base characters being very limited and weak across many dimensions, movement, attack speed, damage, defenses, mana, Even small upgrades found in item affixes feel substantial and tangible in gameplay. Finding boots with plus 20% movement speed feel great, belts with HP and resistances dramatically increase survivability, and a weapon that increases your damage by 20 would give you a huge edge over enemies in the early game. It's good to note that D4 also has these simpler affixes as well, but since characters in D4 can innately kill so many enemies so quickly, the effects of offensive affixes aren't as intuitively felt. Defense's affixes too don't feel particularly significant since damage by enemies are either negligible or they are one-shotting your character no matter what. Mixed in with scaling enemies, which are essentially moving goalposts, it's often hard to feel the connection between your item stat increases and the tangible differences in gameplay. Going back to Diablo 2, with their characters starting out so weak, there are so many stats that are useful to you. The catch is that with the way affixes are spread across different gear slots, you are often forced to make trade-offs. Resistances are crucial for survivability and can be found on any gear slot. You want as much as you can to hit the max limit, but you also want plus skills, attack speed, life, leech, and a bunch of other stats as well that can also be found on multiple gear slots. Items that contain every single affix that you'd like are very rare, so a lot of your gearing decisions revolve around considering competing items with very different benefits for the same gear slot to find a combination of stats that best allow your character to progress in the game. Diablo 4 also has some degree of these trade-off decisions, but since item effectiveness is so closely tied to item power and the ever-inflating stat ranges that come with it, the correct decision is almost always to upgrade your gear to the higher item power item with the higher DPS stat and the higher armor stat. The consistent need and availability to upgrade your current gear to categorically stronger gear until the endgame pushes these interesting trade-off decisions to the side. At the endgame, some of these trade-off decisions come back, where affixes and their roles matter much more, but the crowded affix pool full of conditional affixes, randomly ordered affix listing, and sheer volume of drops you need to check make the entire experience tedious. Diablo 2's itemization continues to succeed by making all different types of items useful and worth considering. Unique items can be incredibly powerful, such as the iconic Shaco, but rare items too can compete for gear slots if they roll well. A number of green set items are also competitive and provide extra bonuses if you wear multiple pieces of the same set, again adding to the many trade-off decisions that test the player's understanding of what combination of stats is best for them to proceed. The basic white and gray items should also certainly not be slept on, as they can be socketed with specific combinations of runes to create powerful rune word gear, which includes some of the best options in the game. Blue items perhaps gets the least amount of love, but still have their place in rolling best-in-slot javelin gloves and making endgame monarch shields. The diversity in viable items coupled with the game's significantly lower drop rates makes so many more item drops in Diablo 2 feel special and meaningful, almost giving the game a roguelike quality since you kind of have to roll with the punches with what the game gives you. Of course, at some point you can go out of your way to target farm specific items, but with so many different items being effective in their own way, combined with the rarity, players are often encouraged to consider possible ways to make use of the items that they do get. Runes. I mentioned rune words earlier, but I want to highlight how engaging the rune system in Diablo 2 is. Runes are socketable items that grant certain affixes when inserted into pieces of gear with sockets. There are 33 different runes of increasing rarity, and each one provides different affixes to gear. This system alone is interesting on its own because it allows you to craft items with certain affixes that you need, such as shoving a bunch of Rao runes into a helm for big fire resistance. Their main purpose, as hinted earlier though, is to craft rune word items, which is done by inserting certain runes in a certain order into a specific gray item base with the right number of sockets. Some of these rune word items are incredibly powerful, and the reasons I enjoy this system so much are 1. It's aesthetically interesting, with rune words adding a level of mystique and mystery to the game, and 2. It makes runes dual purpose and allows players to make incremental progress towards powerful gear. This helps smooth out the difficulty curve by providing another avenue to gearing, alongside finding rare and unique items. Runes add this extra bit of character and depth to the itemization, making basic white items competitive, while it is typical in other games to have white items categorically outclassed by the rare item tiers. The rune system does have its issues though, particularly 2 that come to mind. First, rune words are barely explained in-game aside from one hint in a quest. Players are expected to use external resources to find information on what these rune words are, how to make them, and their effects. This immediately makes the system obtuse to newcomers and cheapens the wonder that this system could have potentially had if they included in-game hints or quest lines that helped you discover these runewords. The other issue is that certain runewords are just too strong, pushing out other competing items from being considered. Luckily, most of the most egregious offenders, Enigma and Grief, are very late game items and are extremely difficult to obtain, so I still stand by my point that the itemization until the very end game in Diablo 2 offers many trade-off decisions. The biggest offender, though, is the Spirit runeword, which offers too much to cast in builds for far too cheap. This one may need some adjusting. Overall though, I still appreciate the rune system and see it as a strong component to Diablo 2's itemization for what it offers aesthetically and how it serves as another dimension for gearing that players can consider. The legendary aspect system in Diablo 4, by comparison, is much more centralized and mandatory. Its flexibility in allowing players to cut and paste aspects onto different items counterintuitively funnels the itemization chase to focus on aspects and stat sticks, both of which are found in the rare and legendary item pool. Finally, when it comes to the overall structure of the game, Diablo 4 is again lacking. The campaign was fine, but as a seasonal game, Diablo 4 is lacking content. Blizzard advertised that there will be over 100 dungeons, but what we really got was like 10 dungeons copy and pasted 10 times. The open world portion of the game scales entirely with your level, so it feels almost the same at all points in the game. It lacks any intrinsic reason to explore, nor extrinsic gear rewards to incentivize participating in it. No secret areas, no secret bosses, no intricate quest lines or puzzles that could take advantage of the exploratory nature of open world design. Nightmare dungeons are also just copy-pasted normal dungeons, now added with even more frustrating one-shot mechanics. There's a point where you realize that you've been doing essentially the same exact content at level 5, level 30, level 70, and so on. Enemy HP and damage goes up, and so does your damage, but the gameplay that you are experiencing barely evolves. Interesting bosses are non-existent until you reach Uber Lilith, but most players would have moved on to other games way before then. Severely limited stash space discourages playing new characters, and overall there are few reasons to keep playing after you've seen most of the content. Diablo 2 has a much simpler, straightforward structure. You play the campaign on normal difficulty, then nightmare difficulty, and then hell difficulty. That's mostly it. There are limited endgame activities afterwards, but what really drives Diablo 2's replayability is the itemization, which has so much meat on its bones that hunting for the best items and playing through the game as different classes is still incredibly satisfying. Enemies in hell difficulty are very dangerous and tanky, so it's still rewarding even after finishing the game to continue pushing your character's gear to reach points where you can finally invalidate the monsters that have dunked on you before. If it isn't obvious already, I personally prefer the slower, more old-school stylings of Diablo 2 over Diablo 4's new school design. Part of me wishes that Diablo 4 captured more of Diablo 2's DNA, especially when it comes to itemization and difficulty. But I can acknowledge that Diablo 4 is made for a wider, more casual audience, and that the decision to make the combat and progression loop more immediate and faster makes sense for that purpose. I've genuinely enjoyed my time with Diablo 4 for what it is, but it's hard not to feel a bit disappointed that the magic Diablo 2 was able to achieve through its itemization and more deliberate gameplay didn't make it into the new entry. I'm happy for whoever is still enjoying Diablo 4, but hey, if you haven't checked out Diablo 2 20 years ago, Diablo 2 Resurrected is a great way to jump into a timeless classic that many will continue to enjoy for more years to come.